This is the top of the mountain, I think, and not only with the storyline, with a great competitor. Roman's a legit competitor for me.
No one comes close, or so the story goes, because for years and years now fans have shared a list that supposedly came straight from Brock Lesnar himself. 10 wrestlers, ranked in strict order, approved by the most feared man in the entire business. There is just one problem with that story. That list never existed. Brock Lesnar has never sat down and named his 10 greatest wrestlers. He has never ranked anyone publicly. He has never signed off on a single one of these viral posts that keep getting shared as if they were fact, year after year. It is a myth, and it did not appear by accident. It spread because of exactly who Brock Lesnar is as a person. He does not do a podcast every week. He does not post his personal opinions online for the world to see. He grew up on a dairy farm in South Dakota, doing hard physical labor long before he ever stepped foot in a wrestling ring. And that upbringing shaped a man who values privacy, family, and quiet routine over public attention of any kind. He rarely gives interviews outside of his wrestling character, and when he finally does break that silence, it is usually somewhere unexpected. His own autobiography, a rare, candid sit-down on the Pat McAfee show. Almost never a traditional wrestling interview built for hype. That silence created a gap, and websites rushed in to fill it with sensational headlines promising something Brock never actually gave anyone. Because here is what makes the real story so much better than the fake one ever could be. Brock Lesnar really has praised wrestlers throughout his career. Not in a ranked list built for clicks. Not in a neat countdown designed to go viral. In real interviews, in his own written words, in rare moments when he genuinely let people see what he actually respects in this business. And because Brock almost never hands out compliments freely, every single name that follows in this video means something real. He is famously difficult to impress, by his own peers' accounts, and by his own. He has openly said he does not care about eventual Hall of Fame inductions. He does not care about leaving behind some polished institutional legacy for the company to celebrate later. He measures his own life using only two standards: being a genuinely good provider for his family, away from the cameras entirely, and standing as one of the most financially successful attractions this business has ever produced. So forget the fake countdown you have seen shared online for years, the one with no real source behind it at all. This is the real one, built entirely from what Brock actually said, from his own autobiography, from verified backstage accounts, and from interviews that actually happened on the record. Counted down from 10 to 1, ending with the single man who changed the entire direction of his career before he ever became a household name. Watch closely, because by the end you will understand exactly what kind of wrestler it actually takes to impress Brock Lesnar, and it has almost nothing to do with what most casual fans assume makes someone great in this business. You might expect a list full of the flashiest performers of his era. Instead, you are about to get a list built entirely around toughness, trust, and the quiet business of drawing money, values that rarely trend online, but clearly meant everything to the man himself. Keep that difference in mind as each name arrives, because the gap between what fans expect and what Brock actually respects is really the whole story here. To Brock, that gap between spectacle and substance is everything, and it is why so many performers who dazzled fans for a single night never earned even a passing mention from him afterward. Number 10. Big Show. Paul White was not just the biggest man Brock Lesnar ever stepped into a ring with. He was one of the safest, and to Brock, that distinction matters more than almost anything else a performer can offer. During his very first run in the company, between 2002 and 2004, Brock named Big Show as his favorite giant to work alongside out of everyone on the roster, and it becomes easy to understand why once you look closely at what the two men actually built together in that short window of time. Big Show had a rare combination that very few men his size ever managed to develop over a full career. Genuine strength, obviously, given his sheer size, but also an agility and a controlled awareness of his own enormous body that let him move believably around the ring despite carrying that much weight. Most men that large move carefully, almost nervously, aware that a single wrong step could genuinely hurt someone standing across from them. Big Show moved with a strange kind of confidence instead, the sort that told everyone watching he knew exactly where his own body was at every moment, even while briefly airborne above the ring. That combination gave Brock something genuinely valuable early in his career. It let him look like a completely unstoppable monster, without ever putting his own body in real, unnecessary danger, because Big Show could absorb serious punishment and deliver it right back in a way that always looked convincingly controlled to a live audience. Their most famous moment together happened on SmackDown, broadcast on the 12th of June in 2003. Brock superplexed Big Show off the top rope, and the ring itself appeared to violently collapse underneath both of them, live, in front of a national television audience. To the millions of people watching at home, it looked like total, unplanned chaos, a genuine accident captured entirely by chance. It was actually one of the most carefully engineered stunts of that entire era of the company. Reinforced corner posts, built specifically for that one segment. Hidden explosive triggers timed down to the second. And most importantly of all, total trust between two enormous men who both understood exactly what was at stake physically if the timing went wrong even slightly during the fall. A single mistimed movement, a support beam placed a few inches off, and either man could have suffered a genuinely serious injury in front of a live national audience, with no warning at all. Brock respected that Big Show was willing to take that very real risk, purely to help make Brock look like a genuine force of nature so early in his career, before he had truly established himself. That willingness to absorb real risk, to put someone else over convincingly, is something Brock rarely forgets about a fellow performer. It is the very first clue in this entire list to how Brock actually judges greatness inside this business. It is never really about who looks the flashiest walking down to the ring under bright lights. It is about who you can trust completely with your own physical safety, and who is genuinely willing to make you look strong, even when doing so costs them something themselves. Big Show never once complained publicly about that arrangement, and years later he even confirmed in interviews just how tightly planned that entire ring collapse actually was, laughing about how convincingly it fooled an entire audience who genuinely believed they had just witnessed a real accident. It is worth pausing here for a moment to notice something fans often get wrong when they debate Brock's standards online. Most fans build their own mental rankings around who felt the most exciting to watch live, who had the best entrance, who told the best story on the microphone. Brock's standard with Big Show had nothing to do with any of that. It was about a single moment of trust during one dangerous stunt, and whether the man across the ring protected him when it mattered. That gap between what fans usually value and what Brock actually values is going to keep showing up again and again as this list continues, and by the time you reach the very top of it, that gap will explain almost everything about the man himself. Number 9. Shelton Benjamin. Long before Brock Lesnar was smashing through wrestling rings on national television in front of thousands of fans, he was a champion amateur wrestler competing at the University of Minnesota. That background in real, unscripted competitive sport, rather than scripted entertainment, shaped almost everything about how Brock came to evaluate the people around him later in his career. And it is exactly why his lasting respect for Shelton Benjamin runs so deep even decades later. The two men were teammates as Golden Gophers, competing together at one of the most respected amateur wrestling programs in the entire country at that time. Later, their paths crossed again inside Ohio Valley Wrestling, the developmental territory where so many eventual main roster stars were quietly shaped before ever reaching television. There, the two of them teamed together as tag partners under the name the Minnesota Stretching Crew, a pairing built on genuine shared history rather than a company simply throwing two large men together for the sake of convenience. Fans watching that developmental territory at the time often had no idea they were seeing two future main roster performers refining their craft side by side, drawing directly on years of amateur training the audience never saw. Brock has repeatedly called Benjamin one of the single most naturally gifted athletes to ever step inside a professional wrestling ring. Full stop. Not the most famous performer on the roster at the time, not the most decorated in terms of championships won, the most gifted, purely from an athletic standpoint. Benjamin moved with a dexterity that most performers of his own size never managed to develop, transitioning smoothly between explosive bursts of power and precise technical wrestling in a way that immediately stood out to anyone who genuinely understood real amateur wrestling mechanics up close. To most fans watching from home, professional wrestling might look like pure showmanship, a performance built entirely around characters, costumes, and ongoing storylines. To Brock, having come up himself through actual competitive amateur sport before ever entering the business, it always looked like athletics first, entertainment a distant second. Shelton Benjamin represented that pure athletic foundation better than almost anyone else Brock ever crossed paths with over the years. Someone who genuinely could have competed at a serious national level in real amateur wrestling and simply chose, instead, to bring those hard-earned skills into the professional ranks. That underlying authenticity earned him a permanent place in win Brock's respect. One built on years of shared history rather than a single passing storyline that faded once the cameras stopped rolling. Even here, early in this list, a clear pattern is already starting to form. Brock does not measure the people around him by how their character is written or by how many championships hang around their waist at any given moment. He measures them by whether they can be trusted physically and by whether their skills are genuinely real underneath the performance. That same pattern will keep repeating itself all the way to the very top of this countdown. Number 8. John Cena. On the surface, Brock Lesnar and John Cena could hardly look more different as two performers. One is a quiet, guarded farm boy from South Dakota who has spent much of his career actively avoiding the spotlight whenever his contract allowed it. The other became arguably the single most recognizable face the entire company has ever produced, doing hundreds of media appearances every single year and eventually becoming a genuine mainstream celebrity far beyond wrestling itself. But underneath those obvious surface-level differences, Brock saw something in Cena that he clearly values above almost everything else in this business: the raw ability to draw real, measurable money at the box office. Both men headlined some of the very biggest pay-per-view events in the company's entire history, often directly against one another, sometimes across multiple encounters spread out over several years of storytelling, and both men clearly understood something that a lot of talented performers never fully grasped during their own careers. The real measure of success inside professional wrestling was never a 5-star match rating handed out afterward by critics writing online. It was ticket sales. It was pay-per-view buy rates counted up after the fact. It was putting actual people in actual seats who were genuinely willing to spend their own hard-earned money, specifically to watch you perform. Brock has spoken about sharing a mutual, unspoken respect with Cena that was built entirely on the brutal physical demands of main event touring, the relentless year-round schedule, and the real toll that carrying an entire company's business takes on a human body over the course of many years. Cena embodied Brock's own personal philosophy of drawing power, just wrapped inside a completely different public package. Where Brock was the quiet, terrifying monster who barely spoke, Cena was the loud, deeply polarizing face of the company who somehow kept fans buying tickets no matter how they personally felt about him at any given moment. That striking difference in public style, paired with the exact same underlying business results, is precisely why Brock came to respect him so deeply. Fans often assumed the two men disliked each other, simply because their personalities seemed so far apart in every interview either of them gave. The truth was closer to the opposite. Two performers who each carried the company through some of its most demanding years understood something about each other that outsiders rarely picked up on at all. Neither man ever needed to explain that respect to the other in lengthy interviews. It showed up instead in the way they worked together at the top of the card. Two performers who understood, better than almost anyone else around them, that a wrestling company survives on box office numbers, not on how a match is scored the next morning by people who are not actually paying for a ticket. Number 7. CM Punk. In 2013, Brock Lesnar found himself in a feud that genuinely surprised a lot of longtime fans watching at the time. CM Punk was noticeably smaller, more of a talker by nature, more of a pure technician inside the ring, a completely different kind of performer from the giants and monsters Brock had usually destroyed on his way through a typical storyline. The feud built slowly over several months of television, with Punk needling Brock verbally, in ways very few performers on the roster would have dared to attempt. Their eventual no disqualification match at SummerSlam that year became one of the most celebrated matches of the entire decade among fans and critics alike, and by Brock's own later account, he genuinely enjoyed building the entire story from start to finish. What impressed Brock about Punk was never really his size or his raw physical strength, because Punk simply did not have either advantage available to him against a man of Brock's stature. It was Punk's mind that stood out instead. Punk understood story structure at a level most performers never fully reach in their careers, patiently building genuine tension across weeks of ongoing television, rather than relying on a single dramatic match to do all the heavy lifting by itself. He was also fully willing to take real, significant physical punishment inside the ring, absorbing brutal offense match after match to sell the David versus Goliath dynamic between himself and a man roughly twice his size. That genuine willingness to suffer for the sake of a believable story, combined with a sharp, almost calculating intelligence about pacing, character work, and audience psychology, is something Brock rarely encounters in performers half his own physical size. Punk proved through that entire feud that greatness, in Brock's eyes at least, was never only about raw muscle or overwhelming power. Sometimes the single most impressive thing a wrestler can do is genuinely outsmart the monster standing across the ring from them and make an entire arena believe it, week after week, right up until the final bell. It also helped that Punk was not afraid of Brock personally, at least not in any way that showed on camera. He talked to him the same way he talked to anyone else on the roster, and that lack of fear, paired with genuine respect, is a combination Brock has always responded to far more than simple flattery. Before moving further up this list, it is worth pausing on something Brock said directly, years later, that ties these first four names together perfectly. During a candid appearance on the Pat McAfee Show in February of 2022, Brock offered a blunt, unfiltered critique of a lot of modern wrestling talent. He expressed real frustration with younger performers who chase flashy, high-risk sequences purely for their own sake, instead of focusing on character development, physical credibility, and genuine financial return for the company that employs them. His summary of the entire business, delivered without much softening, was simple. Figure out how to fill seats. Stand out as something genuinely unique. Generate real revenue, instead of constantly worrying about landing your next complicated move in front of a crowd that might forget the entire spot by the following week anyway. That single interview explains almost everything about why the names on this list earned his respect in the first place. Number 6. Roman Reigns. Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns spent years as genuine rivals, headlining WrestleMania against one another in 2015, again in 2018, and once more in a brutal last man standing match at SummerSlam in 2022. For a long stretch of that entire rivalry, fans watching at home were deeply split on Reigns as a performer, cheering loudly for Brock specifically because he stood in Reigns' way. Some saw him as a forced main eventer, pushed into a top spot before he had genuinely earned it in the eyes of a skeptical audience. Brock saw something quite different slowly developing over time, and he was not shy about saying so openly once he actually saw it happen. He openly praised Reigns for eventually finding his real identity inside the ring, years into his run at the top. Not the version the company had originally tried to sell to a resistant audience early on, but the version Reigns grew into, entirely on his own terms. A performer Brock has directly and publicly called a genuine superstar. To Brock, that kind of gradual evolution mattered far more than any single match result or any individual championship reign along the way. Reigns eventually learned how to carry the full financial weight of an entire promotion on his shoulders, drawing serious, sustained money as a legitimate box office attraction, rather than simply occupying a spot near the top of the card by default. Watching that transformation happen in real time, across years rather than months, gave Brock a front row seat to exactly the kind of growth he respects most. Someone who kept working at their craft quietly until the doubters simply ran out of arguments. That is the exact language Brock consistently reaches for when judging anyone in this business, whether they are just starting out or already firmly established at the top of the card after years of paying their dues. It is never really about how many individual moves a performer can string together inside a single match. It is about how many people they can genuinely convince to spend their own money watching them do it, night after night, city after city, for years at a stretch without the crowds ever fully disappearing. By the time their rivalry reached its final chapter at SummerSlam in 2022, the two men were no longer working as a monster crushing a rookie. They were working as two established main event draws, each fully capable of carrying a show on their own name, and Brock's respect for Reigns by that point had nothing left to prove. Number 5. The Rock. Before Brock Lesnar ever became a star in his own right, he needed someone else entirely willing to make him one first. At SummerSlam in 2002, Dwayne Johnson, already one of the single biggest names in the entire wrestling industry at that point in time, dropped the undisputed WWE Championship to a 25-year-old rookie with barely any real experience on the main roster. That one single decision instantly transformed Brock into the youngest world champion in the company's entire history up to that moment. Brock has always understood exactly what that particular moment cost The Rock on a personal level. Johnson was already actively beginning his transition toward a massive future career in Hollywood, and he genuinely did not need to put over a total newcomer on his way out the door of the wrestling business. He chose to do it anyway, because doing so protected the long-term health of the business itself and set up its next major attraction for years to come after he left. Few established stars at that level of fame are willing to make that kind of decision, and Brock has never pretended otherwise when the subject comes up. Brock views that specific kind of selflessness as one of the very highest possible forms of professionalism inside any wrestling company. Passing the torch cleanly, without ego getting in the way, without quietly fighting to hold on to the spotlight just a little longer, purely to protect the future of the business as a whole. The Rock did exactly that for Brock at an absolutely pivotal moment in both of their very different careers, and Brock has never once forgotten what that quiet sacrifice meant for his own rapid rise to the top of the industry. It is a lesson that keeps reappearing again and again throughout this entire list. The simple idea that true greatness sometimes means deliberately stepping aside at exactly the right moment, purely for someone else's future benefit. It is a lesson Brock never forgot, and one he would go on to apply himself years later, choosing his own spots carefully and stepping away from full-time wrestling more than once when he judged the timing was right for his own career and his own family. By now, a full picture of Brock's personal thesis is coming into focus, and it is worth stating plainly before continuing any further. Brock Lesnar does not view professional wrestling as an art form built around subjective opinions or complicated choreography for its own sake. He views it instead as a severe, genuinely high-stakes business, one designed to generate maximum revenue while simultaneously minimizing real, career-ending physical damage to the people involved. Every single name so far on this list fits directly into that unforgiving framework in some specific way. Number 4. The Undertaker. Few men across the entire history of professional wrestling represent pure stability the way Mark Calloway does. Brock Lesnar and The Undertaker fought one another across two completely different eras of Brock's own career, separated by more than a full decade, and each individual feud left a permanent mark on wrestling history in its own distinct way. Their first collision came during the early 2000s, including a genuinely brutal Hell in a Cell match at No Mercy in 2002 that pushed both men close to their absolute physical limits in front of a live crowd. In between those two eras, both men went their separate ways for a long stretch of time, Brock leaving for a run in mixed martial arts while The Undertaker continued building his own legendary WrestleMania streak year after year, largely untouched by anyone else on the roster. Then, more than 10 years later, came the single match that shocked the entire wrestling world beyond almost anything either man had ever done before in their careers. At WrestleMania 36 in 2014, Brock Lesnar ended The Undertaker's undefeated streak at WrestleMania entirely, a remarkable run that had stood at 21 straight victories across 3 full decades of the show's history. That one single moment instantly rewrote wrestling history overnight, and it still remains one of the single most talked about results the entire business has ever produced, even years later. But Brock's genuine respect for The Undertaker extends far beyond that one shocking result alone. He has repeatedly pointed to Calloway as the true bedrock of the entire locker room throughout his career, a figure whose calm professionalism and stoic leadership helped hold the backstage culture together for decades, through multiple entire generations of talent coming and going around him along the way. To Brock, longevity and quiet consistency matter far more than flash or a single unforgettable highlight reel moment. The Undertaker represented both of those specific qualities for longer than almost anyone else in the entire business, and that sustained consistency earned him a genuinely permanent place near the very top of Brock's personal list of respected peers. Even after ending the streak in 2014, Brock has spoken about Calloway with a kind of respect usually reserved for someone senior in any workplace, an acknowledgement that Calloway had quietly guided the entire industry through eras that could easily have fallen apart without someone steady standing at the center of it. Number 3. Eddie Guerrero. If there is one single name on this entire list that reveals the deeper emotional side of Brock Lesnar, it is Eddie Guerrero. Their rivalry reached its peak at No Way Out in 2004, when Guerrero defeated Brock cleanly to win his very first WWE Championship, a moment still remembered today as one of the most celebrated in the entire history of professional wrestling as a whole. What made this particular moment so genuinely meaningful was never just the athletic performance happening inside the ring itself, although that performance was excellent in its own right by any measure. Guerrero was a true master of subtle body language, careful and deliberate pacing, and completely believable emotion, the kind of deep, layered ring psychology that Brock, despite his own overwhelming size and raw power, deeply admired every single time he watched Eddie work a match. Backstage accounts from that era confirm that Brock was fully invested emotionally in putting Guerrero over on that specific night, understanding clearly the real-life journey Guerrero had personally taken through addiction and back toward genuine redemption in front of the entire wrestling world watching. For a performer as guarded as Brock, choosing to invest that kind of emotional energy in someone else's storyline said a great deal about how much respect had already built up between the two men behind the scenes, away from any camera. After Guerrero's tragic and sudden death in 2005, Vicky Guerrero later revealed publicly that Brock would embrace her every single time they happened to cross paths backstage in the years that followed, telling her over and over again how much he still missed Eddie every single day without fail. That is simply not something Brock Lesnar says openly about very many people in this business at all, and it tells you nearly everything you need to understand about how deeply that one rivalry actually affected him on a personal level, far beyond the storyline itself and everything it accomplished on screen. Guerrero never had Brock's size, his amateur pedigree, or his natural physical gifts. What he had instead was a complete command over an audience's emotions, and Brock, for all his power, clearly recognized that this kind of skill was every bit as rare and every bit as valuable as his own. Number 2. Curt Angle. Brock Lesnar and Curt Angle share something that almost no one else across the entire history of professional wrestling can genuinely claim for themselves. Both men reached the absolute peak of amateur wrestling before ever turning fully professional. Angle is a 1996 Olympic gold medalist, competing successfully at the single highest level the sport of amateur wrestling has ever had to offer anyone. Brock is the 2000 NCAA Division I heavyweight champion, dominating college wrestling completely before the company ever came calling with an offer. That shared, rare foundation created an instant and genuinely unusual bond between the two men, inside a locker room mostly filled with performers who had never competed at anything remotely close to that elite level themselves. By the time WrestleMania 19 arrived, both men had already spent years proving themselves inside a business that had little patience for performers, without real athletic credentials behind their character. That shared foundation is exactly why their eventual main event together carried so much extra weight, long before either man even stepped through the ropes that night. Their defining moment together came at WrestleMania 19 in 2003. Angle was quietly working through severe neck damage at the time, an injury that would very soon require immediate surgical intervention just to protect his basic ability to walk normally afterward. Brock, meanwhile, was carrying the enormous personal pressure of winning his second WWE Championship in the true main event of the single biggest show of the entire year. During the match itself, Brock attempted a shooting star press, slipped badly on the wet ropes, under-rotated in the air, and landed directly on his head in front of an entire sold-out crowd, suffering a serious, genuine concussion in real time in front of everyone watching. For a few terrifying seconds, nobody at ringside knew exactly how badly he was hurt, and the match easily could have ended right there. Angle, despite carrying his own severe, painful injuries that same night, guided a visibly disoriented Brock carefully through the remainder of the match, somehow communicating through the fog of that concussion to help finish the planned sequence as safely as humanly possible under those frightening circumstances. In interviews given long afterward, both men openly praised the other man's sheer toughness that particular night. Angle for competing at all with a genuinely broken neck, Brock for somehow finding a way to finish the entire match despite real, serious trauma to his own brain in the moment. That specific kind of trust, forged together in the absolute worst possible circumstances imaginable for two performers, is exactly why Angle sits this high on Brock's personal list of respected peers. Number 1. Curt Hennig. No single person shaped Brock Lesnar more than Curt Hennig, known affectionately to fans everywhere as Mr. Perfect. When Brock first arrived in the then World Wrestling Federation as a young, powerful athlete with almost no professional wrestling experience whatsoever, it was Hennig, introduced through veteran amateur wrestling trainer Brad Rheingans, who took him under his wing almost immediately. And it was Hennig who personally gave Brock the single defining philosophy that would go on to shape his entire career from that point forward, for the next 2 decades. Get in to get out. Hennig had seen it happen to performer after performer over the course of his own long career, talented men who gave the business everything they had, only to walk away years later with broken bodies, empty pockets, and nothing left to show for decades of sacrifice. He was determined that the same thing would not happen to the young powerhouse standing in front of him, still learning the basics of an entirely new profession. Hennig warned Brock directly, in blunt and unflinching terms, that professional wrestling had a long, genuinely painful history of using up talented performers, until their bodies and minds were completely worn down, often leaving those same performers with almost nothing left once the business had finally taken everything it wanted from them. He told Brock to treat the entire business as a straightforward transaction from day one onward. Extract maximum financial value while the opportunity is there. Protect your own body at every possible opportunity along the way. Leave the business entirely before it eventually takes everything you have left to give it. Brock absorbed that hard lesson so completely and so thoroughly that it explains almost every single major decision he went on to make throughout the rest of his career. When Hennig passed away suddenly in February of 2003, Brock was utterly devastated by the personal loss. In his own autobiography, Death Clutch, he wrote openly that he thought about Hennig every single day afterward, mourning the loss of his closest friend inside the entire wrestling business, someone who had given him far more than simple wrestling advice over the years they spent together. So there it is, the real list, finally revealed in full, from the ground up. Not the one that the internet invented years ago and has kept recycling ever since for easy clicks and cheap engagement, but the one built entirely from Brock Lesnar's own words, his own personal autobiography, and the honest accounts of the people who actually knew him best throughout the different stages of his long career. Curt Hennig taught a young, completely inexperienced Brock Lesnar exactly how to survive inside a business built, historically, to chew people up and discard them without a second thought. Every single other name on this entire list simply proved that same hard-earned lesson correct. One match, one moment, and one hard-earned piece of genuine trust at a time, until the pattern became impossible to ignore for anyone willing to actually look at the evidence, instead of repeating the same recycled headline. That is why, decades later, Brock still speaks about Hennig with more open emotion than he shows almost anywhere else in public, and why every other name on this countdown fits somewhere underneath that same lesson, whether they ever realized it themselves or not. That, far more than any viral list the internet ever invented out of thin air, is the real and complete story of who actually earned Brock Lesnar's respect over the course of his career, and why it genuinely took every single one of these 10 people to teach him that lesson in full.